We'll jump right in. So this is John Barr with the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity within the Office of Employment and Training. I'm here this afternoon with Charles Dooley and Matt Hillen to provide a webinar that will highlight several of the new requirements under the Federal Uniform Administrative Guidance at 2 CFR 200, or Code of Federal Regulation 200, and the State of Illinois Grant Accountability and Transparency Act. Although this presentation highlights the WIOA, or Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, Youth Career Pathways Grant Application, or Notice of Funding Opportunity, the concepts that we're going to talk about today can be applied to other grants that are administered or will be administered by the Office of Employment and Training. I want to make a few disclaimers before we start today. This presentation is for your information, and it doesn't supersede any of the terms of your grant agreements or other award documents. The presentation is not intended to provide you with financial or legal advice, and we would definitely encourage you to consult with your consultants or your accountants, your legal folks, and other professionals to determine what will be the best course of action as we get, especially as we get into some of the management pieces of grants for both these formula and non-formula grants. We recognize that that the grant procedures under GATA, or the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act, we recognize that these will continue to be developed, and we're working to make them as efficient as possible within the boundaries of the GATA law, and we're working both internally here at the department and with the Office of Management and Budget. And this may include some additional changes and updates in workflows, and we're looking for your feedback as we move forward in this process. So today's presentation is broken into two parts. Part one of the presentation will focus on the grant application pre-award phases, and part two will focus on the actual grant application and award documents. One other word before we get rolling here, and I turn it over to Matt. I do recognize that today's presentation, there are a number of non-formula grantees, so grantees that are not administering a local workforce innovation area, and that's great. So we really appreciate you jumping on this call. We recognize there may be some LWIA staff that are on the call today. This presentation will be provided live tomorrow in Springfield, tomorrow afternoon at 1 o'clock. If you have other staff that are interested or plan to join that, or if you yourself are you're welcome to attend both of these, but know that this material will be presented tomorrow as well. And then we are also planning to have an additional session that will cover this type of information in the near future here in the spring, that will provide updated information as we have more standard documents available for you to see. So with all that, I want to introduce Matt Hillen with the Department of Commerce, who's the program manager with the WIOA Youth Career Pathways Grant Opportunity, and that is it's kind of the open grant opportunity that is the first one to utilize or one of the first grant programs, competitive programs, to utilize the GATA documents with the workforce here in workforce. Without further ado, Matt, you want to kind of give us a context of what we're looking at?
Thanks, John. Just wanted to quickly interject why we're here and why we're not here. John did a great job of describing exactly what the point of this conversation is. It's to provide everyone with the fiscal knowledge necessary to complete applications for competitive grants in the world of the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act, or GATA. We want to make sure that we give everyone those tools so that they can, if they choose to do so, apply specifically for our open WIOA Youth Career Pathways, NOFO, or Notice of Funding Opportunity, which is due on February 1 at 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. We do have the details on that up at the website that Chelsea just posted in the chat box, illinoisworknet.com/youth2017. We do have instructions there as to where to send that, but I did want to just kind of reinforce when that's due, that all of your agreements are due. Every part of your application is due at that point in time. It's not just the application and then you can send more stuff later. Everything has to be packaged and sent at that time. So just wanted to make that clear. And you know, if you have questions on the programmatic side of this NOFO, that's not what we're here to address today. We are having an additional Q&A session that will address those concerns. It's going to happen next week. Chelsea is going to be sending out the announcement for that webinar session to everyone who has signed up for this webinar today. If you haven't already received that, you will receive it soon. It will also be posted to the Youth 2017 Illinois WorkNet site. So for all the programmatic concerns and questions that you have, save those. We will definitely address those in full in our session next week. Today, concentrate on the very fun and somewhat complicated world of GATA fiscal issues that will be presented to you in full today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chuck Dooley, who's with our Fiscal and Monitoring Unit. He's the manager of that unit here at OET Commerce.
Thanks, Matt. Today we're going to cover the Illinois Grant Accountability and Transparency Act, otherwise known as GATA, which is a state law to increase accountability and transparency in the use of grant funds. And one of the requirements of the uniform guidance is that each pass-through entity have in place a framework for evaluating the risks posed by applicants before they receive awards. So today we're going to outline the pre-award process and requirements that the state has implemented to comply with the federal uniform guidance. The grantee pre-award requirements that must be completed prior to receiving a grant award include grantee registration, grantee pre-qualification, the financial risk assessment, otherwise known as the Internal Controls Questionnaire, the ICQ for short, the programmatic risk assessment, and all these pre-award requirements are effective for the current state fiscal year. There is an exemption in place for local workforce innovation areas for state fiscal year 2017 for WIOA and trade grants. However, if local areas have not yet started the process, we recommend that they start the process now. The centralized website for the GATA pre-award process is grants.illinois.gov. And if you go to the GATA website at grants.illinois.gov and click on the Grantee Links tab, that is the entry point for the grantee pre-award process, which includes registration, pre-qualification, and the fiscal and programmatic risk assessments. If you go to the Grantee Links tab and hover over that tab, you'll see a drop-down option for the Centralized Indirect Cost System, and that drop-down option provides resources related to the indirect cost rate application process with the state of Illinois' indirect cost rate vendor, Crowe Horwath. And if you go to the Indirect Cost System on the Grantee Links tab, you'll find frequently asked questions you'll find training modules both related to indirect cost rates in general and applying for a rate from Crowe Horwath, the state's indirect cost rate vendor. There are also forms and indirect cost rate templates, and for reference, there's also the Department of Labor Indirect Cost Rate Guide. Now, separate from the GATA website is the Crowe Horwath Crowe Activity Review System, otherwise known as CARS, and that is what grantees will use to elect the indirect cost rate option, and if necessary, complete the indirect cost rate negotiation process. The Crowe Activity Review System is not available to the public. Grantees will only receive access to the CARS system after their ICQ or their financial risk assessment has been accepted by the state. The first step in the process is grantee registration. All grantees must be registered with the state of Illinois. This is done by completing and submitting a one-page grantee registration form. A link to the form is provided from the Grantee Links tab on the GATA website. The state receipt of the form triggers the Grantee Pre-Qualification verifications.
Right. And that website again is grants.illinois.gov.
And on this slide is this shows the one-page grantee registration form where you'll enter, it's an online form, you'll enter your organization's fee number, you'll enter the DUNS number, the organization name, and the contact information. And there were two questions at the bottom of the form that were cut off, so they're not on the slide. But those two questions are, does your organization have 2 or more years experience with Illinois grants? And the second question is, did your organization receive more than $20,000 in grant awards from Illinois during the last fiscal year? If you answer no to one of these questions, you may not be able to proceed to the next phase in the pre-award process, which would be the risk assessment, at least not until you're notified that you're a grant award finalist. Like I said, the registration form is an online form. At the bottom of the form is a submit button, so after you complete all the required fields, you click on submit, and it's automatically routed to the state for verification.
And so, again, GATA is working to implement these procedures, and we're in a bit of a transition year. And I would point out for all state grants, starting with the next fiscal year 2018, they are going to definitely enforce that entities will have to be registered or go through this pre-qualification phase, before you apply for your grants. We are kind of in this period of transition here between, the old processes and the full implementation of GATA, but the folks asked us to highlight that starting fiscal year 18, you will have to complete this pre-registration process prior to your submission. This year, I would definitely point out, especially with the youth RFA, we will definitely work with you on these registration tasks, as it relates to your submissions and making sure that, the information, your registration information is up to date and will help you through this process. Sorry.
So once you submit your registration form, the state verifies the information submitted on the form, including that you have a current DUNS number. So if you don't already have a DUNS number, that is required. The state verifies SAM registration, which is the Federal System for Award Management. So if your organization is not registered on the System for Award Management, that is also going to be required. We also verify good standing with the Illinois Secretary of State, and we also verify that your organization is not on the federal debarred or suspended list. So if there are no pre-qualification issues and the state's able to verify all the information, the registration and pre-qualification are one and the same, and you're done. Otherwise, if there are issues, the state will email qualification issues and ask the organization to notify state when the remediation of the issues is completed. And those issues could include the DUNS number is not current, the organization is not registered on SAM, or the SAM registration is not current, the entity is not in good standing with the Illinois Secretary of State, or the entity is debarred or suspended from federal grants. And the last issue, federal debarment or suspension, is not something that can be remediated. If you're debarred or suspended from federal grants, then you're ineligible for state grants. And one thing I should mention is that the state is developing its own excluded parties list that should be available in the near future and will be used in conjunction with the federal excluded parties list. Once the pre-qualification is completed, the next step in the process is the fiscal risk assessment. Actually, that's automated. The fiscal risk assessment is automated. The grantee will automatically receive an email with a link to the risk assessment, which is triggered by grantee registration. So once you submit that grantee registration form, shortly thereafter, you should receive an email with a link to the ICQ or fiscal risk assessment. The grantee will then complete and submit the automated ICQ, or risk assessment. When the risk assessment has been accepted, the grantee will receive an email with the confirmation number. So once you receive that email, and that will go to the contact that is listed on the registration form, you should keep that for future reference because it has your confirmation number, and it also has contact information in case you have any questions. The fiscal risk assessment is centralized. It applies to all state agencies and programs. If you do one annually, then it applies across the board. On the other hand, the programmatic risk assessment is unique to the program or award. So depending on how many awards or programs you apply for, you could end up submitting more than one programmatic risk assessment annually. Based on the two risk assessments, the programmatic and fiscal, a risk profile will be determined, which will be used for monitoring and also determining grant-specific conditions. For example, if your organization rates medium or high risk, there may be specific conditions applied to the grant agreement, including, for example, additional reporting requirements. After the ICQ and the risk assessments have been completed and accepted, the grantee has to select an indirect cost rate option in the Crowe Horwath Centralized Indirect Cost Rate System called the Crowe Activity Review System, or CARS for short. An indirect cost rate is simply a device used for determining the appropriate amount of indirect costs that each program should bear. It's the ratio between the total indirect expenses and some direct cost base. And the options that are available for a grantee to elect in the CARS system, which are also the same options that are available on the indirect cost rate tab on the budget proposal that you'll submit with your grant application, are as follows. You can use a federally approved indirect cost rate if you already have one, or if you're in the process of applying for one, if you're a direct recipient of federal grants. And then you'll make that election in the CARS system, and CARS will require that you upload your negotiated indirect cost rate agreement for your federal rate. The second option is to negotiate a rate with the state of Illinois' indirect cost rate vendor, Crowe Horwath, by submitting an indirect cost rate proposal to the CARS system. The third option is to use the 10% federal de minimis rate of modified total direct costs. And you have to make that election on the CARS system because you have to certify that your organization is eligible to use that de minimis rate. And according to the uniform guidance, only entities that have never negotiated an indirect rate with the feds and for state purposes with the state are eligible to use the de minimis rate. In addition to that, you have to spend less than $35 million in federal financial assistance annually to be eligible to use the de minimis rate.
Right.
Go ahead.
So I just want to jump in here that, Chuck is getting into some pretty technical information as it relates to indirect costs. The topic of indirect costs is, we'll have a presentation in and of itself. There's a number of resources that we're going to point to within this webinar that we would encourage organizations to review. And I know that a number of local workforce areas, there's some additional training on indirect costs, later this month. But again, I know as we're kind of digging into this very specific detail that this is a fairly complex issue around indirect costs. The point is that there is a system as part of the registration process that organizations are going to have to work with your financial management office to make a selection. And it is a fairly significant decision that you are making when you make this registration. So I would definitely encourage you to, review some of the other training materials, and we may schedule some additional indirect informational webinars at a future date, but I'll leave it at that as we kind of go through the actual nuts and bolts, and then I'll come back in the second part and talk a little bit more about the difference between an indirect cost and a direct cost.
Yeah, and we're not going to go in depth about indirect cost rates. That's beyond the scope of this. We're just trying to inform you of your options so that you're prepared when you prepare your budget proposal and also when you complete the pre-award process. But there are resources available on the GATA website. There are PowerPoint slides on the resource library on the GATA website. And then there's a webinars tab, and then there are webinars related to not only indirect cost rates in general, but also applying for a rate on the CARS system.
Right.
The remaining options for indirect rates are you can use a restricted rate if you have one from your federal cognizant agency. And then the last option is elect not to be reimbursed for indirect costs at all. For example, if you don't want to be bothered with getting an indirect rate, but even if you choose that option, you still have to make that election on the CARS system because that's going to be included in your grant agreement. Continuing our discussion of the CARS system, like I mentioned previously, grantees will not be invited to CARS until the pre-qualification and the fiscal risk assessment are accepted by the state. CARS will allow the grantee to elect and document the indirect cost rate option, and if necessary, start the indirect cost rate negotiation process with the state's indirect cost rate vendor, Crowe Horwath. All indirect cost rate proposals or elections of other rate options must be received within 90 days of the start date of receiving the state, 90 days of receiving the state award. Like we mentioned previously, there is an exemption for local workforce innovation areas for WIOA and trade grants for the current state fiscal year, which expires June 30th, 2017. Who is required to use the Crowe Horwath CARS system for indirect cost rates? The short answer is everybody. Any organization that receives a grant from the state is required to use the CARS system to elect their indirect cost rate option. If a grantee organization has a federally negotiated rate, they are required to provide information through the CARS system. The system will provide instructions to complete this process. And one of the things you'll be required to do is to upload your current negotiated indirect cost rate agreement to the CARS system for review and approval by Crowe Horwath. If a grantee organization chooses to elect a 10% de minimis rate, they are required to make this election in the indirect cost rate system. The system will provide instructions to complete this process. And one thing I should mention is that the de minimis rate is often chosen because the documentation requirements are a lot less burdensome You don't have to submit an indirect cost rate proposal, but there is information that is required to be submitted, and there are templates for the de minimis rate and other types of rates on the GATA website that you can review. And then this is an example of an email invitation to use the CARS system. Like I said, after your pre-qualification and risk assessment is accepted by the state, an email from Crowe Horwath will automatically be generated asking you to make your indirect cost rate election on the CARS system. You'll be assigned a user ID and password, which you'll be asked to update when you first log on to the system. And then the automatically generated email will also include other information, including a link to the CARS system and contacts of Crowe Horwath, both a phone number and an email address if you have any questions about making the election or submitting your indirect cost rate proposal. And like I said, technical assistance information is available on the GATA website if you want to review that beforehand. The templates and forms are also available on the GATA website. So this is just the email invitation that you'll get to log on to the CARS system only after your fiscal risk assessment is accepted. Continuing our discussion of the CARS system, Illinois received permission from the federal government to centralize the negotiation of indirect cost rates. So just like the fiscal risk assessment and pre-qualification are centralized and apply to all state programs and agencies, the CARS system allows the grantee to negotiate one rate if they receive grants from multiple state of Illinois agencies, and that rate will apply to all state grants and agencies. All state of Illinois agencies must accept a centralized negotiated rate unless there are federal program limitations, cap requirements, or supplanting issues. And there are frequently asked questions on the GATA website regarding indirect cost rates. One thing that is frequently asked is whether a grantee can accept a lower indirect cost rate or use a lower rate than negotiated with the state or the feds. The answer is yes. However, state agencies are not allowed to force or coerce a grantee to take a lower rate than was negotiated. But otherwise, a grantee may voluntarily choose to charge less than the negotiated rate or nothing at all to a grant or several grants. All grantees are required to make the indirect cost rate elections in the centralized CARS system. The organization has 90 days from the start date of their first award to elect an option in the CARS system. And this is something that has to be done annually. In subsequent years, it must be done annually within 6 months after the end of the organization's fiscal year end. So just like you have to submit your indirect cost rate proposal annually, if you have a federal rate, you'll have to do the same thing for state rates, and you'll have to, even if you don't use a negotiated rate, you still have to make your election in the system on an annual basis. Now, we've been talking about the CARS system, but there's also, on the Grantee Links tab in the GATA website at grants.illinois.gov, if you hover over the Grantee Links tab, you'll see on the drop-down menu the centralized indirect cost system. And like I mentioned, that is not, the CARS system is not publicly available. The centralized indirect cost system option on the GATA website only provides training modules, resources, frequently asked questions, and other technical assistance related to the CARS system and the process for negotiating or electing an indirect cost rate option. So that link on the GATA website includes frequently asked questions, training modules, forms, and templates. And there are training modules and even webinars on indirect cost rate proposals. If you have any questions, there are resources available in addition to the resources I already mentioned, which are on grants.illinois.gov, the GATA website. You can find some resources on Illinois WorkNet, and then you can find links to the uniform guidance on the U.S. Department of Labor website. And the U.S. Department of Labor, when the uniform guidance requirements were implemented a couple of years ago, they did extensive training on the uniform guidance, and their training modules are available on the last website listed on this slide, etasmarttraining.com. And if you have any questions, I'd recommend you refer to that, and that covers a broad array of topics from cost principles to indirect cost rates to cost allocation to procurement and property standards. So that concludes the overview of the GATA pre-award process. And now I'm going to hand it back over to John to discuss the grant application process.
Great. Thanks, Chuck. And I want to take a minute here to just pause and answer. Oh, we're getting a bit of feedback here. Is that better? Okay. So I want to take a minute to respond to some of the questions that we've got going in the chat pod. First question: do you complete the complete before applying for a grant? I think it was, do you complete the registration process before applying for the grant?
Yeah, the answer would be yes.
Yeah.
You can do that before applying for the grant, or while you're in the process of completing a grant application, you can do that. If you don't have any prior grant experience with the state of Illinois, your pre-qualification process may be delayed until you are notified that you're a grant finalist. But otherwise, any entity that has previous grant experience with the state should be able to start that process now, or you can wait until you you decide to apply for the grant and do it while you're applying for the grant.
Right. And this is another, as we move forward in this transition year, I anticipate that we'll have some, standard kind of workflow of, when you apply for a grant, you do kind of the pre-registration, but generally that would be the process. We would point out that, this registration process and the ICQ is in regard to your grantee, your fiscal entity, right? So it's not just about your program. It's about your entity. So if you are a large nonprofit organization, it's the full entity, and the registration is keyed in on your DUNS number. So if you are a large organization, let's say that you're an organization or a unit of local government, a county, right? You may have separate DUNS numbers for separate departments, and each of those departments could submit a separate registration. But generally for nonprofit organizations, we would expect that many of them, or most, would have only one registration, and it would be for the entire entity. And those conditions would apply for all of the grants as it relates to the fiscal and administrative risk assessment side of things. As Chuck mentioned, there was an additional program risk assessment that would be specific to the grant that you're applying to.
And there was another question that asked, how long is the registration and risk assessment good for before it must be renewed? And the answer to that is that both the pre-qualification and the risk assessment have to be done annually. So it would be, and one thing I should mention is that for state fiscal year 18, which begins on July 1st, there will probably be new pre-qualification elements that are reviewed. Right now there are just 4, SAM registration, DUNS number, federal debar and suspension list, and good standing with the Illinois Secretary of State. So that would be done annually. So right now, this would be state fiscal year 17, so in state fiscal year 18, you'll have to do it again. The timing may depend on, if you only have one program and the program year begins on September 1st, then as part of that grant application process, each program year, you'd probably, that process would probably coincide with the program year start date, but both pre-qualification and risk assessment would have to be done annually. And then there's another question, do subrecipients have to follow our indirect cost rate, or do they have to apply for their own? And at this point in time, I don't know if there would be any subrecipients under these grants, but I know there are definitely subrecipients under WIOA formula grants. And at this point in time, the GATA system, the CARS system, cannot be used by subrecipients. If they don't get a state of Illinois grant and they don't have grant history with the state, then they cannot currently negotiate a rate with the state, although there's a possibility that's being discussed of opening up GATA and CARS to subrecipients in the future, but that won't be done during the current state fiscal year. So I don't know if there would be any subrecipients under this program, but for local areas and WIOA formula grants, there'll be guidance that'll be issued in the future about subrecipients.
So additional resources, you can go to www.grants.illinois.gov, and that is the Office of Management and Budget. You'll go to the GATA website. You can also go to the web links at www.illinoisworknet.com/GATA, GATA, and there's some great resources there and additional links.
Yeah, and to be specific, the webinars on the GATA website, you just bring up the website and then you click on the webinars tab, which is directly adjacent to the grantee links tab, and that'll bring up a lot of webinars. And then if you go to the resource library, that's lists different topics in alphabetical order, and if you scroll down to webinars at the end, that'll have links to various PowerPoint slides for different webinars.
Right, and I would want to add that a lot of the content that we have developed today is modeled off of the information that was provided and developed by the Office of Management and Budget, as well as the Department of Commerce's Accountability Office. So we definitely appreciate their support in developing and presenting the information to everyone today. Next question, how long does it typically take to receive the pre-qualification approval notice?
It could be soon as within days. It may take, in some cases, a couple weeks. For the most part, it's automated, but there are some elements that have to be checked annually, manually. Specifically, good standing with the Illinois Secretary of State has to be done manually, and then it has to be accepted by the state. And the agency that will review and approve the ICQ will be the applicant's fed or state cognizant agency. That will be the system will look up the DUNS number and look at the grants for each DUNS number and determine the state cognizant agency. And so the ICQ will be routed to that agency for acceptance. So whoever your state cognizant agency is will review and approve this. So it could take anywhere from a couple days to a couple weeks.
Right. And just to follow up on that piece, so what Chuck mentioned, the state cognizant agency, it's modeled off of the federal. A lot of what the state is putting in place to standardize is modeled off of the federal grants.gov system. And the state cognizant agency is essentially the state agency that your organization does the most business with, right? So if you have a grant with Commerce and you have a grant maybe with Human Services, if most of your money comes from, or most of your grants come from Human Services, then Human Services would be your cognizant agency. So the idea is the agency that knows you the best or has the most amount of grant funds that are issued would take the closest look at your risk assessment factors, while certainly working with other agencies. But from a fiscal and administrative standpoint, as Chuck mentioned, that state cognizant agency is responsible for reviewing those risk factors on behalf of every agency that you may do business with. So Chelsea, I see there's no more questions in the chat pod. I do want to open up, because I think we're still at a good stopping point for some of the preliminary or overview on GATA. I want to open up the phone lines to see if there are any other kind of final questions on this first piece of the presentation. Can you open up the phone lines?
Everyone's been unmuted.
Great, thank you. So any additional questions on the first part? All right, sounds like there's none, so I think we'll go ahead and we'll move to the second part of the presentation. And I'm going to be kind of working through many of the documents that you have received and are posted here on the webinar portal. So Chelsea, I think in the interest of keeping the sound quality up, and tell me if you can still hear us clearly, if you could go ahead and mute those phones again. We'll go ahead and move to the next section here.
Your microphone has been turned on.
I'm going to go through a number of these documents, and I want to preface this by saying that many of these documents, if you are current grantees or previous grantees, you've seen a lot of this information in different forms. There are certainly going to be some new procedures and new documents that will be developed, but a lot of the boilerplate information will remain the same. The intent of all of this is to standardize the grant process throughout the different agencies. That's the whole point of the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act. But we also know that there are some important distinctions between state agencies and definitely between programs. And certainly we know that our federal funds have their own set of rules and regulations that are extensive, and those rules and regulations will trump any of the GATA rules and regulations, and you'll see that information as we get into the uniform grant agreement piece of this. So I want to start by just looking at, and again, we'll use the WIOA Youth Pathways grant opportunity as a good example of what to expect for future competitive or semi-competitive grant applications. Instead of an RFA or a request for application, grant opportunities or RFAs are now going to be called Notices of Funding Opportunities, or NOFO for short. You don't have to use that language. So there are a number of standardized sections within the Notice of Funding Opportunity, and they're included here on the screen. I want to take a few minutes, Chelsea, if we can go to the NOFO, and if you could pop that into the screen there, and just want to walk through some of the key components so you can see what I'm talking about. And we'll give you just a second to open that up.
Wait, I'm sorry, John, I missed that. Which one did you want me to pull out?
If you can pull out the NOFO 75, that one right there, we can.
Gotcha.
Oh, that is that's the standard application. Sorry. Here we go. Okay, so this is the standard information that's included in a grant opportunity. There is a standardized website at grants.illinois.gov that will have all of the funding opportunities for every state agency. And so if you go to that, you will see that there is this active grant opportunity. And it's my understanding that most of these grant opportunities will have a similar format. So as you look at the application, or if you look at the funding opportunity, you'll see that there's kind of a standard program description with some definitions, and this is specific to our program here with Commerce and the WIOA Youth program. Provides the objectives and background. So this is all program-specific information that will change depending on what grant opportunity you're looking at. In this case, it's a youth program. The next application may focus around talent pipeline and providing incumbent worker training. So that information will be listed here in the beginning portion of the grant with the background and other goals information. The next piece will be about the funding. Talk about the specific funding source, the anticipated award amounts, whether or not pre-award or application costs would be allowed. Generally, the creation of an application is never an allowable cost, but we may allow costs that are program-related, startup costs, while you're negotiating a grant agreement. That may be allowed, but we'll talk about that in this portion of the NOFO. Next piece, we'll talk about the eligibility information, talk about eligible applicants. If there are specific requirements, again, a lot of the information that Chuck went over in the beginning part of this presentation is listed here, talking about the pre-registration requirement. We go through the WIOA eligibility and performance requirements. So many of our workforce grants, if it's a youth or if it's a talent pipeline or other grants, is directly associated with that federal money, and it has those federal conditions around reporting specific activities and ensuring individuals are eligible for the services that you're providing. And so we'll outline that information in the NOFO as well. We'll talk about, obviously, the eligibility, performance. We'll talk about cost sharing and matching requirements. We'll talk, this one includes information about indirect and administrative costs. The next section talks about the specific submission information. And Matt, if you want to chime in or highlight any of those specific details. Obviously, the application for the WIOA Youth is due on February 1st, and it includes, obviously Matt is the program manager, includes what is required to be submitted, and in this case, you're looking at a technical proposal that outlines all of the these elements: your applicant capacity, documentation need, specific program requirements and considerations, additional considerations, priority populations. So these are things that I think Matt has covered in some previous webinars.
Yeah, for those of you and those of you who have not, who did not participate in one of the in-person sessions, those were required as a condition of grant application. And in those sessions, we discussed a lot of what's in these particular sections of the NOFO, and that's basically around where we're placing our priorities and what we want to see in applications. And then, also addressed here are some of the appendices to the application, the logic model, the action plan, and the self-assessment, the Career Pathways self-assessment tool. So, it talks about those. It talks about the MOUs that are required as part of your application. Then it gets to the budget.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we'll go over that in a little bit of detail here as we go through. Just kind of round it out. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. I would point out, as a matter of format, as you'll notice here in the, if I can get it to scroll right, you'll notice in the technical proposal section, you'll notice that those elements are consistent with the review and selection information. So how your proposal is evaluated, there's a direct correlation there between what's required and how it is evaluated.
And that's something that you're definitely going to want to make sure that you're familiar with. I mean, I said at the beginning we're not necessarily going to address a lot of programmatic concerns today. We've got time set aside for that in the future, and many of you have already sent me very specific programmatic questions, and you're welcome to continue to do so. And I do have a little bit of a flood of those. So for those of you who haven't heard back from me, you are on my list, and you will hear back from me in short order. But it's pretty self-explanatory in here, but what I always tell people is make sure that you're careful about reading through this, both in what is required that you submit and how that correlates, how each one of those pieces correlates to how the evaluation of the projects go. And that will spell out to you kind of how we're how we're thinking about applications and how we're going to review applications. That'll make that a lot clearer to you as you check that out.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So part F of the standard notice of funding opportunity is the award administration. So this is a lot of the logistics information, right? So talking about how you'll be notified, what the payment schedule would be, administrative requirements, project reporting, all of our grants are monitored. Then you see the lengthy list of WIOA, Federal Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act requirements, and again, the state agency contact. FOIA, typically applications are a matter of public record, and if there's something that you want excluded and you have a a reason that we can exclude that under the Freedom of Information Act, we can do that, but you've got to mark it appropriately, and we'll work with you to do that. So for this application, and Chelsea, if we can switch back to the presentation, that'd be great. So for this presentation, or for this this application, we require the executive summary, the technical proposal, the required technical and programmatic forms and exhibits, which typically will include the resumes of key program staff. All of in the youth, there's some additional technical attachments that are included. Memorandum of understanding or other partnership agreements. Those are key, especially when you're using federal Department of Labor dollars as it relates to the eligibility of people who you're serving, as well as the reporting of activities. And last is the budget. So again, check the notice of funding opportunity for the specific things on the WIOA Youth Pathways, but this gives you an idea of what to expect for this current grant and others moving forward. Quick question here, Matt. You're new to this youth opportunity and didn't attend December. Will there be other technical assistance sessions?
I mean, email me offline, and I'll ask you about your partnership structure and maybe see if there was a partner that was already there. For folks that are planning on applying, do the same. My email address is in the NOFO, so I'm easy to get a hold of. I think my phone number's in there too. It's pretty easy to find me. Just, let me know so I can find out who your partners are and if maybe you've already connected to it in some way.
All right, great. Thanks, Matt. So the next piece or the next document that we'll go through is the actual uniform application for state grant assistance. This document replaces the standard Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity grant application for those of you who may be familiar with previous grants, and you'll notice a number of similarities. You'll see that you have already, in many cases, you would have already done your pre-award registration, as Chuck outlined in the first portion, but as part of your submission, we need to have this uniform application. So it will include, definitely in our case, where we have the federal funds and the federal catalog of federal domestic assistance information is listed, and that will be included in your grant agreements. It will include the state funding opportunity information. Will include some of the basic information that's included in the full notice of funding opportunity. Will include what's required to be submitted, and you'll see in this case signed application, an executive summary, a technical proposal, which includes that logic model, career pathway self-assessment, worksheet, action plan, resumes of key staff, partnership agreements, MOUs, and the budget proposal. Additional application information, your legal information. Again, we're keying that on your federal taxpayer ID number as well as your DUNS number. That's definitely key because that's where we look at how you're registered. Those are really those key numbers that the state uses to determine your risk factors and how you're registered. Organization contact information and organization in your finance and administration office, and that's obviously if we've got questions around your risk assessment or other admin issues. We ask that you provide information about the areas that are effective, legislative congressional districts, brief description of the project, start and end date, anticipated. Again, we know that some of this information you may not know, but if you can provide the information to the best of your ability. The estimated total funding, total project funding, and the last piece, number 48, is the information about your organization's financial background, your entities, the dates of your fiscal year, the amount of state-funded grant awards that you are expected to receive over the next fiscal year, and the amount of federally funded direct grants your entity is expected to receive over the next year. And then most importantly is the signature and certification. So like this is the form, right, where you're signing off that all of your information and the information you provided as your application packet is true and accurate to the best of your knowledge. So Chelsea, we could go back to the presentation. I would anticipate that both our formula and non-formula grantees will be required to submit this uniform application document at least once. This is one of those things where we may have, as part of the establishment of local workforce areas, we may have you submit this once per program or perhaps once per program and fiscal year, but some of those procedures we still need to work out. But I would point out, for every competitive application, whether or not you are a local workforce area or other entity, nonprofit or others, you would need to submit this uniform application as part of your application package. All right, so the next slide, or the next part is, we kind of went through this outline here, already went through the document, so I don't think we need to reiterate that. I want to provide an overview of the uniform budget template. And this is a large Excel spreadsheet that is standardized across state agencies. We know that if you look at it on its face, that it is, I don't want to say overwhelming, but it is, it looks complex, right? In the neighborhood. Important because I understand that we have a mixed audience, and again, I appreciate your indulgence as we kind of go through some of the key concepts here around costs. The key is, you're using federal money. The costs have to be allowable, reasonable, and allocable. The state of Illinois is using a standard or a uniform budget template that is modeled off of the federal form SF 524. And it was determined that this is the form that most closely or would cover as many different programs throughout the state. And we recognize that there may be some updates that are needed as we work through this. So I would encourage you to definitely work with Matt and work with us as you put your application together. The bottom line is that in this transition year, we're definitely not looking to penalize or have someone in a gotcha situation because of a specific form, and that certainly will not be looked at as part of your competitive evaluation. We're looking at the specific content as opposed to the form that you're looking at per se. Now, it's not to give everybody a pass, right, on using the form, but we recognize that these are new templates and new forms, and the bottom line is that we want to work with you to work through this kind of staged implementation. But it's important to know for all federal grants and state grants, for that matter, that they have to, all the costs have to meet the standards, right? And for many of you who are grantees, you know these, but we will highlight these three areas around allowable. Obviously, they need to be necessary and reasonable. They have to conform to the limits of the funding source. You have to be consistent with your own internal policy, so you can't have one set of rules for our state and federal grants and some other grants or other programs that you might administer. You have to operate in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, and you have to make sure that you adequately document your costs and justify those costs, and that's one of the purposes for this budget form. Next slide is to talk about the reasonable. You have to illustrate that the cost is reasonable, and again, these are definitions that are pulled right out of the Uniform Administrative Guidance, and you see the reference there. I don't want to belabor them too much. You have to ensure that whether the cost is if you're paying for these, that it's reasonable, right? If it was your money, would you spend this? Is this a reasonable cost for the service that is being provided, service or whatever activity is being provided? Basically, as the regs say, whether individuals acted with prudence in administering the federal funds. And again, that you're consistent with your procedures, that you don't have one set of rules for this set of grants and a separate set of rules for the federal grants, or you double charge the federal grants because, well, it's grant money. You got to have the same consistent application of your program, obviously within the limits of the federal funds. I would point that out. Allocable costs, again, that you can point to the benefit of the program, so you're not supplanting these federal funds or these grant funds to support your overall operations. And if you say, well, I'm gonna train 200 people, you're going to train 200 people, and the costs in the grant are going to go to support that initiative, as opposed to, well, we only needed this much of the award to train those 200 people. So again, you have to properly allocate those costs and ensure that the costs are incurred specifically to the benefit of the program that you're administering. I want to follow up on some of the conversation that Chuck had in the beginning portion of the presentation around the types of costs, both the program and the administrative costs. the U.S. Department of Labor, through the administration of WIOA, specifically identifies what are administrative costs, and that the application of that definition, right, needs to be applied, or you need to apply that definition to these grant funds, both formula and non-formula. So we have a document that specifically is pulled out of the final WIOA rule that outlines some of the specific activities around administrative costs, and they're generally general management functions around accounting, budgeting, payroll, procurement, property management, facilities, monitoring, audit, investigations. Those are generally administrative costs. I'm going very quickly. Program costs are costs that are directly associated with the functions dealing with the individuals you're serving, right? So in WIOA speak, those are the participant costs. Costs that, it could be your staff time that is providing the coordination of the program, the supervision of the program, costs related to training providers, costs directly associated with program support. All these things are direct program costs. And point out in the slide here that there's a distinction between the direct and indirect costs, and on the next slide here, it talks about specifically what's considered a direct cost, what is an indirect cost. And direct costs, as Chuck mentioned, are costs that can be identified specifically within a final cost objective. So you can directly link your activity back to the grant. So if you're a program manager, for a youth program manager, and you're working directly on this project, you can directly link that back to this grant. An indirect cost may be someone who is could be an executive director who has no direct relationship to this project. But that's not to say in their normal operations, but if, let's say, your executive director was directly involved, maybe quarter time on this initiative, and especially during a startup period, they're directly involved. You can look at directly charging that time toward the grant, and you may include that as part of your application request. Again, if you can directly relate an individual's activity to the grant, that can be included as part of the requested costs that would fall outside of indirect. Okay, so now we'll get to the uniform budget template, and we'll switch to the application. But I would also point out on that slide that talked about the program and the administration, there is a module, a training module that the U.S. Department of Labor has pointed out, and the address to that is listed in the last slide of Chuck's presentation. Those SMART modules talks more about the difference between program and administrative costs, as well as the indirect and direct costs and the allocation of costs to specific program budget objectives. But again, it's a little outside of what our scope is today. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to the budget template here. So hopefully you're seeing the budget template here. And this is the uniform budget template, and it has a number of different sections. You'll see that it has a number of different tabs, and the first tab is the summary, and so you'd be able to go ahead and enter this information. I would note that the information in these tables roll up from the tabs that we'll go through. So, for instance, the personnel tabs, the information included, you'll have to go to personnel to load that. So you would enter the information in this section C, and then it would populate in the section A. There are a number of in this form, there are a number of standard budget categories that you'll see throughout the state of Illinois and the Department of Commerce, and those lines are personnel, fringe, travel, equipment, supplies, contractual, consultants, construction, occupancy, R&D, telecom, training and education, direct administration, and miscellaneous costs. Line 15 is reserved for grant-specific lines, and then the totals at the bottom. I would point out that in this standard budget form, the items that are grayed out are not allowed in that specific grant opportunity, and so you will not be able to enter those. I don't believe a tab will be included, and you wouldn't be able to request those costs. I would point out also, if we go and look at personnel here, so if we look at personnel, you will see at the top section here that the definition, the budget line item definition, is listed here. So you'll see that it is pulled directly out of the Uniform Administrative Guidance, and it has the citation listed there. And so again, the intent is for the state to be consistent with the federal government, and that's the overall goal is to categorize costs consistently across programs. So in this case, we have an additional layer of complexity because of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act requires a breakout between how we are serving in-school youth and out-of-school youth. So we need to break out, and you need to break out in your budget narrative, you need to break out the individuals that are serving in school and out of school. I got to tell you, we were racking our brains and trying to figure out if there was a more straightforward way to illustrate this, but at this point, this is the best solution that we have, and if you have thoughts and suggestions, we're definitely open to them. But you'll notice on this summary page that for every line item, you'll see that there is both an in-school and an out-of-school. But for the detail tab where you justify those costs by, in this case for personnel, you name the name and the position and the salary and how you came up with the cost. You lay out all that information and break it out for in-school and out-of-school. We also ask that you break out the matching funds and the leveraged funds, and I'll get to those when we go back to the presentation. There's a definition of match and leveraged funds, which I know is a requirement of the application. So again, just to go back, tab 1 is the general instructions that should correspond to everything that you see behind it. Section A is the part where you can fill the top, this top information about your organization. The information in Section A will populate from the specific detail in these line items: personnel, fringe benefits, travel, equipment, et cetera, et cetera. I would point out that there are multiple years that are listed here. At this point, I would advise you just to put everything into year 1. This is a piece that the department is continuing to work through to see if we can modify this a bit. But for right now, for this particular grant, NOFO application, just advise you to put everything into year 1, and if we need to adjust that, we'll follow up with you. So this is Section A. So it is an overview, and again, you'll note that the Uniform Administrative Guidance citation is listed throughout, provides a specific budget line item definition, shows you what's allowed and what's not allowed. If you have any questions about interpretation around that or where a cost should be, definitely you can contact Matt, and he can, connect back with us. So that's Section A. Section A, ICI, is short for the indirect cost rate information. So you're probably wondering, or I was, when I first sat through some of these presentations, why do I care about all this indirect cost rate information? Well, the specific reason is right here in the standard budget form, right? Because you are required to make one of these selections in this tab, in the selection ICI. You have to select that your organization currently has a direct federally negotiated rate, and if you have one of those, you must select that. You can also say that your organization is going to submit an indirect cost proposal to the state of Illinois. You can select one of those options. You can select that the organization has never received an indirect rate from the feds, and you're not going to go in for a state negotiated rate, and you want to apply the 10% rate. You can do that under selection number 3. And then as Chuck outlined in the first part, you can also select nothing under item number 5. Number 4 is for a restricted rate, and if you're in this category, we probably need to talk to you, because we need, we're working out some details around item number 4. Generally speaking, the information in Section A should be consistent with what your organization selected as part of their CARS registration with Crowe Horwath, right? So you went through that whole centralized registration. Your fiscal folks went through and registered all that information. When you get down to submitting your grants, this budget form is going to ask you, well, what did you submit, right? And how are you going to cover the indirect costs? Section B is a summary of the cash matching funds. But again, these funds, this should pre-populate from the specific line items. So you'll see this is section A, that's your grant funds. Section B is your cash match. Section Section B in kind is your in-kind match, and Section B leveraged is your is the leverage funds. Again, we recognize that in a perfect world, this may be laid out a little bit different, where we could see one column for the grant funds, one for cash, one for in-kind, and that comment is definitely taken, and we're working to see if we could incorporate that, but for right now, they're separated in different tabs. The next tab is the certification, and so it is required, the state requires that your chief financial officer or equivalent sign off on this budget application, as well as your the authorized signature sign off. Internally, the Department of Commerce and other state agencies, for that matter, will also have a more formalized review process and sign-off. So as you'll see, there's an extensive amount of checks and balances that is being put in place as it relates to the fiscal management of the grant funds. And as I mentioned, we're working through many of the details, and we're hoping to make improvements and updates as we're able. But again, for right now, it's trying to cover a wide area of potential costs and activities. The FFATA form, that stands for what is it, Chuck? The Federal Funds Accountability and Transparency Act. Is that right?
The GATA Grantee Accountability and Transparency Act.
But I mean the FFATA,
Federal Funds Accountability.
Right. So that's a separate federal law. It's a separate tab here. It's my understanding that grantees will need to submit this information, and in the past, I believe our accounting office may have been in contact with grantees to compile it, but we need to get some additional information and clarification around this. So if you have questions around the applicability of the Federal Funds Accountability Transparency Act form, let us know, and we may include that as part of as a follow-up piece. You are most likely already providing this information. The question is, do you need to provide it on this form, and we'll need to get back with you on that specific piece. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen now, hopefully. And Chelsea, can you tell me, are we back to the presentation?
Yep, we are.
Great, thank you very much. I want to, just because I know we're getting short on time here, we got about 25 more minutes scheduled in the webinar. One of the last documents that we have to go through is the Unified Grant Award. But before we get to that, I think just to go through some of the information, I think I covered most of these slides, so I'm going to go very quickly. You can kind of read them at your leisure. Matching funds, again, I would just point out that matching funds, any shared cost matching funds, they all have to meet those budget line item definitions to be, they have to be, reasonable, allowable. You have to be able to document those costs. For matching funds, it's important to note that these can include contributions from other federal awards, okay? They're provided, could be either a cash match or it could be in-kind services. But again, has to be without other federal funds. Leverage funds are essentially a special category of matched funds, but those are those federal funds, right? So you can't, under that match category, you can't use your other federal, you can't use your other federal funds to count those in the match column. But in this section, the leveraged funds, you can, if there are other federal sources, you can include those. But again, you have to meet all those match requirements, have to meet the budget line item definitions, have to be reasonable and allowable. All right, so the home stretch here is the uniform grant agreements. And for many of you, if you've received grant awards, you'll notice that there is a kind of the department and the state has used a uniform agreement that has evolved over the years. Different agencies have used different grant agreements and other methods of providing awards. And again, the intent under GATA is to make this process uniform across all state agencies. And so part one of the grant agreements is standardized across the state, and it is developed under the direction of the Office of Management and Budget in conjunction with the legal offices of many state agencies and the governor's office. The articles are standard, and you'll note that the part one, and Chelsea, if we could maybe get to the standard or the uniform grant agreement, you'll note that it looks somewhat similar to the agreement that Commerce has used in the past. So you'll see the different articles have been moved around a bit, but it is essentially the same information. Part one includes information that the state really doesn't have any flexibility, or Commerce doesn't have any flexibility in editing. It's kind of our standard boilerplate, and it's information that you would expect. I would encourage you to just kind of go through at your leisure and see how these things will be outlined and reorganized. I would point out that the document that we've provided is for kind of information purposes only, and the actual agreements may look a little bit different, but generally, the purpose of this was to give you what to expect, right? So you can, if you're working with your legal and your grants department, you can go in and start looking at this now, because it should be the standard for many years to come. Those of you who are new to the grant, new to state grants, I would point out that our current grant agreement is about 30 to 35 pages and includes all of these boilerplate components. So I want to skip through kind of the boilerplate information to the exhibits. At the end of the get this just up just a little bit. Oops. Okay, so at the end of part one of the uniform grant agreements, there are several exhibits. And I would point out that we are continuing to work with the GATA team, with OMB, with the department's legal staff and program managers to determine the information that is included in these exhibits. A lot of it is included from your application. Some of the information is populated from your pre-registration activities as it relates to some of the additional terms and conditions of the award that Chuck mentioned. And I'm just going to kind of briefly go through these exhibits now. So Exhibit A was previously, what was it, Part 2 of the grant agreement under this current year, but now it's in Exhibit A. So your scope of work will be Exhibit A, project description, and it will be a comprehensive description of the core functions and activities that will be associated with the award. Exhibit B, and you'll work with your grant manager to develop that, based on your project and your application if you're selected for funding. Exhibit B is the deliverables and milestones. So this is basically a summary of the goods and services, products, and things that you're going to do. What are the clear and objective deliverables that will illustrate how you have met your objectives of the grant. Some of this information will also be related back to some of the reporting that you'll have to provide on at least a quarterly basis. Exhibit C is the payment terms. If, like in our previous grants, if there are pre-award costs, so for instance, if you go in and we go through we receive your application February 1st, we review it and tell you you've been selected to negotiate for a grant, and we can say, well, starting May 1st, you can your project is approved, but you don't have a grant in place, right? Maybe your grant doesn't get executed until May or June 1st, right? So there would be a provision within the grant agreement that has to be listed in Exhibit A, the scope of work that would state prior incurred costs to May 1st in this case. So that would allow you to charge back those costs for the specific project activity while your grant is being finalized. Exhibit C, again, is the payments, and it would talk about if there are prior incurred costs. Application costs, again, are obviously never allowed. Exhibit D is the contact information, and that's similar to our current agreements. Exhibit E are the performance measures, and again, this is an area that we are still with the Office of Employment and Training, we are still working out some of the details as far as what content will go in, especially Exhibit E and Exhibit F around the performance standards. Obviously, there are a lot of implications around when you say performance. That relates not only to the grant performance, but also to Workforce Opportunity Investment Act or Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act performance measures would certainly be at least referenced in these parts. And as many of the local workforce folks know, we're working on getting final clarification on what those will look like. So again, a couple of sections that we'll be working through over the next weeks and months. Let's see, next part. Item G is a listing of state agency contracts It's my understanding that this is not going to be required in all grants, but we'll provide additional guidance once we get to the award stage. So that's good news. Exhibit H is a specific conditions, and these are the conditions that may apply after the risk assessment and merit review of your application, and these may include conditions that were part of the pre-award review. So that's all of the kind of the standard part 1 of the award document. Part 2 is the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity grant-specific information. We have a number of provisions that we are required under a number of laws and other regulations that we have to reference and include, and they are included in Part 2. Not going to go through those in a lot of detail. I want to move to Part 3, which is Part 3 is the project-specific conditions, and this is where we would include all of the U.S. Department of Labor terms and conditions. If you're a previous grantee, it's under our old section 4.4, which outlines all of those key requirements that are tied to our funding source, and those are updated on an annual basis, not only through the federal law regulations, but also our funding agreement stipulates all of the provisions and riders that are included in the federal appropriation and authorization that links the federal money to the awards, and those provisions are outlined currently in Section 4.4, but now they will be included in Part 3 of the uniform grant agreement. All right. So Chelsea, if we could go back to the presentation here. And I have, the presentation again provides an outline of what I've just gone through, and would encourage you to, go through this in detail. If you have any questions, or if your legal and administrative folks have questions about this information, contact Matt or me, and we can get you in touch with the right folks here at the department. Rachel Powell is a great, she's not only our OET's legal person, but she's also on the agency's GATA team, and she's a great resource internally that we work with on the legal side. So again, I would just highlight this slide is included in the presentation twice because we think it's very important because it has many of the key links, right? So many of the things that we've talked about are reiterated in detail. They may have their own presentation, from the Office of Management and Budget. There is a whole additional presentation on the CARS system that is actually presented by Crowe Horwath that talks about the registration there. But to wrap it up today for us, our intent was to give you an overview, although it's very lengthy and detailed of an overview of the updated award documents that the department is going to be utilizing on a moving forward basis as we implement GATA. So with that, I guess go ahead. I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions and answers. And it looks like there may be some in, there's one in the on the chat pod here. With the state budget impasse, we received prior to 2015 were not available. I think it's just put what you have received, because it gives the timeline, I believe. And we just want to know what you've received in the last, I believe, 2 years. So if you haven't received an award in that time period, you can just put it blank. I'm assuming that was on the uniform, just that summary application page.
Registration form?
Well, I think it was referring to the standard or the uniform application document. But it's a good point. I think you're going as your entity, as your fiscal agent goes through the pre-registration process. We will, or the state will, review any of your previous awards to determine who your cognizant federal agency is, based on, what agency gave you the most grants, right? Okay, so Chelsea, if you could open up the phones or unmute the phones, and we'll be happy to take any final questions. So hearing none, I will point out and would say thank you again to Matt and Chuck for their expertise.
Hey.
Hello? Do you have a question? Okay, maybe just some background noise. But again, I would appreciate I do appreciate your participation in today's webinar. As I mentioned, we will have a live session tomorrow in Springfield. We will have additional sessions, probably a live session, because we know this is a lot of content to go through in the Chicagoland area. But as it relates to the Youth Opportunity Grant or the Youth Pathways Grant, we definitely recognize it's important to make sure that we covered the basic information for the February 1st submission deadline. So last call for questions. Their question: will we be posting questions and answers from the live session? Yeah, I think we can do that, Chelsea. If we can capture that. And also, Chelsea, this webinar has been recorded. Is that right?
Yes, and we'll be posting it on the Illinois WorkNet pages as well. Excellent,
excellent. So thank you for that, and thank you for your help throughout the webinar as well. And I apologize for my clumsy technical ability here, and thank you again for sticking through the webinar. And with that, we'll go ahead and close the session, and have an excellent afternoon and rest of your week. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.